I think it gets too I think it gets talked about too heavily in terms of their general audience stuff, right? Like I think they've done a service in the sense that they've really tried to go through the mechanical operations between the Treasury and the Fed and taxing and spending and try to lay it all out. I've gone through some of that stuff. It's fascinating. It's extremely educational. But yeah, I think it is there. Yeah, it could kind of, it's just like when we have these generalized political debates, on the major networks and all that kind of thing. There's a real question of well, when you say pay for the government spending or fund the government spending, what is meant by that? Do you mean literally where do the dollars come from? Or do you mean something a bit more generalized in the sense of how do we manage the trade-offs inherent in government spending? Because the point is not that there are not trade-offs. There are definitely trade-offs. The point is simply that you don't have to worry about where the money comes from. So I think people can talk past each other in the sense that the MMTers can be we don't have to worry about where the money comes from. And then the people who are saying, how do you pay for it? They're like, well, I didn't mean literally how do we get the money? I mean, how do we manage the trade-offs, right?
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper.
And I'm Alexei the Greek. And today we have our returning champion, our favorite guest, Jeff Spross of the Week.
Hi, everyone.
Columnist. Yeah, there he is with that beautiful voice. Welcome back, Jeff. As everyone should know by now, you write for The Week on economics and politics. To get us started, because even to those that are in the know, MMT can be confusing to talk about, maybe you can lay out, for those that know a little, know nothing, or even for those putative experts out there, what it is we're talking about when we talk about MMT and perhaps why it's something controversial to discuss.
Right. Okay. Let me see if I can do this. So modern monetary theory is a school of thought that it's grown up around a few different groups. I'm probably going to get the names of the colleges wrong here, but Kansas City, Missouri, Levy Institute, that kind of thing. Arguably the most prominent person who's been advocating it is an economist named Stephanie Kelton, who was she was like an economic advisor to the Senate Democrats before Bernie Sanders run. She's been involved in Sanders' efforts to kind of get various policies together, Medicare for all that kind of thing. But there's a whole group of economists, a few others like Scott Fulwiler, Randall Wray, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's so if you see their names,
I believe Stephanie Kelton is currently an economic advisor to Bernie Sanders.
She might currently be. Yeah, I honestly, mm-hmm. I haven't kept up.
She is.
I don't know. So the theory, or at least the basic gist, is that the United States is essentially, and this is a common thing, obviously, in a lot of modern Western economies, is a fiat currency issuer, which is to say the United States federal government, the national government, has a currency, the U.S. dollar, and it can make as much of that currency as it wants. And whenever a government has this ability, that comes with a great deal of special economic powers that really, your average politician will talk about the government as akin to a household budget. We have to, when times are tight, the government has to tighten its belt the same way households have to tighten it. And the basic point that modern monetary theory makes is that this is actually backwards for a government that controls its own currency. And this is true of Britain, which obviously has the pound. It's true of Australia, which has their dollar. It's true of Canada, which has their dollar. It's true of any government that has its own currency, has a central bank to backstop it, and doesn't either rely on a gold standard or peg its currency to some other currency. It's just the government with the central bank. The central bank is just an arm of the national government in each case, and the central bank, orchestrates the creation of as much money as they feel is necessary at any given moment, and there's no ceiling on that. I mean, you can completely fuck up your economy, but there's no concrete limit on how much money you can create. You never run out.
And it may be an important side note here, the U.S., like most of the economies, borrows in that same currency.
Right. So this is an important distinction. I mean, like most major economies, Australia, Britain, et cetera, they have to borrow a bit more in a currency they don't control. Britain will have some U.S. dollar, debt in U.S. dollars. It will have some debt in euros. It will have some debt in a few other currencies. The U.S. is unique in the sense that it never, ever has to borrow in any currency except its own. And
can we explain why that is an advantage? Why is that helpful?
So I should say, first off, it's kind of like a historical leftover of the aftermath of World War II and the Bretton Woods system. And the result of all that is that basically all international trade, something like 97%, occurs with dollars on one side of the trade. So basically everyone in the world has to use US dollars. Every country in the world has to use US dollars to engage in trade with another country. And what that means is that you have to have some amount of US dollars on hand to finesse your trade flows, to have some backstop if you run out, you can't sell enough exports and you can't afford the imports you need some excess dollars on hand. And if you don't have the excess dollars on hand, you have to go borrow them. And the key distinction is that if you borrow in a currency you don't control, which is to say if Britain borrows in dollars or if Australia borrows in US dollars, they can run out and they can't make more. Right, like if Britain borrows in the pound, which is like the vast majority of Britain's debt is denominated in the pound, like that, it can never suffer a debt crisis in its own currency because it can create as many pounds as it wants. But it is possible for countries to suffer a debt crisis in a currency they don't control, and this is actually quite common for developing countries. Turkey is going through this right now. A very, very catastrophic version of this crisis is undergoing in Venezuela right now. But for the U.S., it never has to borrow in any foreign currency. Like all it has to worry about is U.S. dollars, which it can print U.S. dollars to the skies and never run out. So it can never, ever default. Like it will never go quote unquote bankrupt.
And to be clear, we don't even have to print the dollars, right? Like, it's not necessarily how many dollars are actually in circulation. There's a lot of just zeros and ones that you adjust, right, in the accounting. Isn't that also true?
Okay, so yeah. So, I mean, we say print money, which is like a colloquialism. The vast majority of money creation in the economy is not physical cash, right? Like, really, like the physical cash is printed at the Treasury, but its distribution through the economy is coordinated by the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve can be thought when you're given your Social Security check or you're a government contractor and you get paid, the money isn't you're not handed. It's not like they print the money at the Treasury and they hand you a bag of cash. The money shows up in your bank account, and the Federal Reserve is basically the connection point between the U.S. Treasury and the banking system writ large. So when the U.S. government wants to pay you for your work on a bridge as a contractor or wants to give you your Social Security check, it just tells the Federal Reserve, hey, hit a button and create new digital money, in this person's particular bank account at whatever private bank they bank at, and off the money goes.
Right. So some countries can use their buttons in that very powerful way.
Right.
In other countries, they don't have that button power,
Well,
basically.
every country has that button power if they issue their own currency. So, like, even Venezuela has its own currency, the bolivar. It's just, in Venezuela's case, and this is also true in a lot of other developing countries, they are deeply dependent on certain imports. Like, Venezuela almost makes none of it, like, has very, very little of its own food comes from its own domestic agricultural production. Almost all of its food comes from imports from the rest of the world. It has to get a hold of dollars to get those imports. So it's like a lot of developing and poorer countries out there, just like huge parts of their economies are essentially done in another currency they have no control over and that they can run out of.
So that's a good, a portrait of the sort of fiscal situation, but why does that matter in the context of like the modern U.S. economy and the political debate about what should be done about taxation and the national debt?
Right. So the way to think about this is that ultimately the thing that matters in what fiscal policy can do and what fiscal policy's limits are the real resources in the economy, which is to say, more than anything else, like the number of human beings you have who, are willing to do labor, but also your physical resources, construction materials, steel, lumber, fuel, basically everything that actual, real, concrete economic activity occurs in. The things that we use to build our houses, the materials we need to build our cars, to make our electronics, and all the rest of it. The money is just a coordinating mechanism for all that economic activity. And so the actual limit is, you can think of the economy as, I'm trying to think of the right metaphor here. I kind of think of it as like a hydraulic tank. And the money that the government issues is the water in the tank. And you need enough water to like pressurize the tank so the hydraulic system works properly. But you don't want so much water that you're like blowing the gaskets off, right? Like if it gets over, like literally economists will refer to pressure in the economy and a high pressure economy as one where inflation is going up. And that is the actual limit, is that if you essentially issue too many dollars into the economy or issue them in the wrong way, you will drive up inflation. On the other hand, if you don't have enough dollars in the economy, you will leave resources unused on the table. And again, since most of the resources are human beings, that means higher unemployment, which translates into lower wages, et cetera, et cetera. As for the national debt, basically, like I said, there could never be a bankruptcy. You can never default. So the actual challenge that the debt represents is not that the problem is not that we could ever fail to be able to pay the debt, or that paying off debt obligations or paying debt service, like interest on the debt, will quote unquote crowd out other spending. Like we can't run out of money, so we can't like have spending be crowded out. But the interest payments on the debt are themselves money that goes into the economy and thus are themselves potentially inflationary. Whether they're inflationary comes down to a very complex question of basically how ownership of the debt is distributed. Most of the debt is owned by yeah.
Just because people might be thinking of all these debt ceiling crises and thinking, what's going on there if we can't default? Because it is true that we can stupidly arrange our own laws to force ourselves into crises, even though we can't technically default. We can make ourselves right. So maybe explain that a little bit for people.
Okay, right. Yeah, I mean, the debt crisis is literally, there's just a law that says we can't issue more debt than X amount, and every so often they raise X amount. The problem that you have is that, like, if you already have debt and you're trying to roll it over, you might have to issue more debt to pay the debt obligations you already have. And so if you have a ceiling on the total amount of debt you can issue, you can hit a point where like you can't roll over any more debt, so you can't pay the debt obligations you already have.
Yeah, so all those showdowns are completely politically created, have no economic basis. They're totally unforced errors.
If you, a individual consumer in the economy or an individual household, you are literally capable of running out of money. Like, there is none more for you. And if you just print some money, you are breaking the law and the cops will come for you. Like, the government is literally the unique entity in the economy with the legal right to create more money. So it can never run out. It can be so dumb that it just says to itself, I'm just not going to make money on some principled ideological stance and thus fail to pay my creditors. But it can never, like, concretely run out of money involuntarily the way an individual or a household or a business or even a state or local government can run out.
So then here's where ideology and economic theory come into play. So we are doing these unforced errors, presumably in some sense, because some people think there's an economic theory that says there will be inflation if we stop deficit spending, or if we don't control the debt, there will be these inflationary problems. And that is a political stance people take based on some theory. So can you tease out for us who's right, who's wrong, and what the difference is between the different economic theories that might include the differences, if any, between Keynesian economics and MMT?
Right.
That's a big question.
Yeah. Okay. So there are lots of layers of different theories that, like, people in Congress and people in these political debates are relying on. And they run the gamut from, like, well thought out economic principles to just, like, rule of thumb folk theories. I think that's my impression anyway. So, like, a lot of Congress people, I mean, the arguments they are literally just, like, reasoning from the government is a household and the government can run out of money. And that's their argument for why we need to, like, not have deficits go too high, why we need to control the amount of debt we have. That's why we need to control the amount of debt the national government has, that sort of thing. And I mean, that's just flat out wrong. Like, the government cannot, like I said, the government cannot run out of money. And the truth is, most economists, or at least sophisticated economists or knowledgeable ones, in my impression, and I would include, like, say, probably most of the economists from the center right to the center left, like people who work at AEI, people who worked in the Obama administration, they all understand this. Like, they get that, like, the government can't actually run out of money. This is common knowledge. The disagreement comes in two forms. The first is how much capacity is there in the economy at a given moment to absorb how much deficit spending. So, there is when the Trump administration did its tax cuts, like, this was going to be big deficits, right? Big new deficits coming down the pike. So, like, a lot of people, like, Jason Furman, who used to work with the Obama administration, a lot of other former Obama economists, they're like, this is a bad idea. Like, this is going to, add deficits when we're already near full employment, because look at the unemployment rate, it's so low, we're below 4%. Like, if you add this much deficit spending while we're this close to full employment or full use of all our real economic resources, you're going to get inflation. That turned out to be wrong for two reasons. The first reason is that, by all accounts, we are not close to true full employment. I mean, we're closer than we were at the depths of the Great Recession, but there are various metrics for, be it like the prime age employment rate, the labor force participation rate, various measures of potential GDP that basically say we actually could very well have, like, a very big gap still in, like, between, like, how many real resources we are using and how many real resources we have total. So that was the one problem. The other problem is that, like, the deficit spending by the tax cuts didn't actually go into employing new resources for the most part. For the most part, it went into corporate profits, which went to shareholder payouts, which just got reinvested in more bidding over financial assets in the stock market. And, it did not lead to that many new people being hired or that many wages going up. Let's see. So I'm trying to figure out how to wrap this up for your question. So I think We need to get to like the distinction between like the Keynesians and the MMTers, right?
Yeah. So this may be a good place to bring that up. So, what you said, is like Alice Rivlin, right, died today, who was the first female CBO director, if I'm not mistaken, pioneering woman. Also, a horribly toxic advocate of austerity and deficit reduction. She was part of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, and there has been this hegemonic ideology, which I think only really has traction on blinkered center-left politicians like Barack Obama and Joe Biden. That's like, oh, the deficit really matters. Really got to get this down. You really got to think about this really hard. It's very important. And especially when you're in a bad recession, that's the opposite. The deficit should go up.
Yeah.
And when Barack Obama, he pivoted to deficit reduction in like February of 2010 with his budget of that year, he just doomed the party to getting wiped out in the 2010 midterms because unemployment was still 9.8%, I believe. So, in terms of the ideology that grips the brains of the kind of very serious people in Washington, D.C. when they're talking about the budget, that's all well taken. But if you read John Maynard Keynes's book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, or whatever it's called, that analysis, which is somewhat different from the way that you've described your, MMT thinking, that pops out. In fact, the whole point of it is designed to deal with the same question of recessions and what sovereign countries should do in recessions. So yeah, how does the Keynesian perspective differ from the MMT perspective?
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is like, I'm not like a formal expert or anything. I'm basically like
No, we said that you are. We said that you're an expert.
I will do my best to try to tease out what I understand the differences to be. So first off, I think to say is that there's an enormous amount of overlap between the two. Like the differences are pretty fucking technical. Like, cause this is basically Keynes's thing is the economy has a certain amount of capacity. Like if there's a recession and use of that capacity falls, you need to deficit spend more to fill the gap. So yeah, I think the first thing to say is there's a huge amount of overlap. In practice, I mean, like I've talked to like different economists who would consider themselves Keynesians to varying degrees, who are like hardcore progressives, who would not consider themselves MMTers. And I think there's a few different disagreements. I think on one level, there's some progressive Keynesians just have a certain amount of, they're not entirely sure if like the debt load could someday get too big, but there seems to be a kind of vague thing like, well, we're not sure what all the knockoff effects of that could be. Maybe it is something we should be worried about as like a prudential thing. Like obviously it's not a huge deal, but maybe we should be concerned about it. I think one difference is that there is definitely just analytical disagreement about like how much capacity is left in the economy, how to measure that, and what's going to happen, like how much inflation could we get and how quickly if we overuse capacity. And another thing that I don't know if it's entirely fair to the non-MMTers, but one thing that I've noticed is I think MMT people tend to pay more attention to the market of the price structure effects of various forms of spending. So one thing I think you see, like, even amongst people who would view themselves as like progressive Keynesians, is like there tends to be a treatment of spending as just kind of like a big aggregate thing, right? Like we figure out, okay, we have so many percentage points of GDP left to fill in. Like we have, that's how big our gap is. So we can have so many percentage points of deficit spending. And there might not be that much, they might not go into that much detail about what kind of deficit spending it is. But one thing I do think you see with the MMT people is a bit more focus on like, well, what exactly is this spending? What will the effect be? So like say with Medicare for all, you're spending, you know, shit tons of hundreds of billions or maybe $1 trillion or more in the economy every year. But what does that spending do? Like on the one hand, you're going to free up an enormous amount of money that people now spend on their healthcare, on copays and premiums and all that kind of thing. That will be new demand in the economy. That will fill in capacity. Eventually, that will be inflationary. I mean, it might not cause inflation, but it pushes up on the economy in a way that if you hit capacity, then you'll get inflation. But Medicare for all also would wipe out the private health insurance industry. So that's a whole ton of spending that goes away. It wipes out a lot of the overhead costs that come along with the private health insurance industry. That goes away, gets replaced with nothing. So these are deflationary effects, actually. These are like things that push down on the economy. And then you have the fact that any like Medicare for all operation worth its salt would like probably put a lot more bargaining pressure on providers, especially on pharmaceutical companies to drive down prices in various places in the health sector. So that too is a deflationary event. Now it's like, you know, you have deflationary forces, you have inflationary forces all mixed in. How do they net out? Well, that's what you need to figure out.
Are you saying, Jeff, are you saying that the Keynesians don't do this in-depth analysis of the combination of inflationary, deflationary effects, and therefore they underestimate how much spending can be done because they're not considering all these things? Or what are you saying this is distinguishing MMTers from Keynesians?
The way I would put it is I see that kind of analysis more often from the MMTers, but I definitely like it. It comes and goes on the other side, I guess, is maybe the way I would put it. And like I said, I want to be careful here because like I do not want to be unfair to like the progressive Keynesian people who do not consider themselves MMTers. Like I think. And it's also kind of a question of like, what part of the conversation are you seeing? Like if you're seeing like really serious wonky conversations, like in back channels and that kind of thing, it can be a lot more sophisticated, a lot more detailed. And then it comes out like, you know, in the policy proposals at the end and the big PR releases. And it's like, well, here's all the ways we're going to pay for like every last dollar that we're going to spend on Medicare for all, even though it's like, well, maybe if we actually go through it, you need to like, you know, offsetting taxes for like half of it, maybe, you know, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. And and this is the thing is like, I think the distinction between like the progressive Keynesian and the MMTers can get pretty blurry, but like it's.
Well, but like we see, I think, so tell me if this is true for both of you. We see more support for higher spending initiatives from MMT economists than from Keynesians generally. Like if you're going to say one side is more conservative or reticent to spend like an extra $1 trillion a year on a Green New Deal or whatever, right? Like there's probably some economic theory that makes MMTers more likely to be like, yeah, go for it. Whereas the Keynesians might be less ready to do that, and this is maybe what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I don't know, Ryan. I'd be curious what your perspective is on that as well, in terms of like just kind of like the political elasticity of what positions each group is willing to take.
Yeah, I would say on the one hand that the sort of mainstream liberal Keynesians are often a little sloppy or maybe politically opportunistic. You do see analyses of the multiplier effect, like what type of spending is going to be more, going to create more economic activity. Tax cuts are less than just direct spending on public works projects and so on. But yeah, as you said, there is also a tendency to maybe pull back, when it's a Republican doing a bad fiscal stimulus in the form of tax cuts, and be like, deficits matter again now. We're going to have an interest rate spike, and that doesn't happen. I guess on the other hand, I would say that there is a tendency among MMTers to really downplay the role of taxation. That, you don't need taxes to fund government spending. And there's a lot of Kelton has a elaborate paper on the specific mechanics of how the accounting works when the government sort of funds itself, and trying to downplay the idea that taxes are necessary to fund anything. And that, I think,
well, but Ryan,
yeah.
Let me ask you, are you objecting to that? Because there's two different reasons to object to that, it seems to me. One could be that it's not true, that she's wrong on the economics, right? And that it is indeed important to fund things through taxes. On the other hand, I could see a lefty response that says, I don't really care if it's economically necessary. I think there's a political good in taxing the wealthy, and taxes operate in a way more than just funding the economy. And there are important things that are politically salient there. So I think it's important to distinguish which are the two critiques that you're using.
Well, I would say it's both, because, the more the sophisticated MMT people, they say, yeah, you need taxes to offset inflation. Right. And so if you were to bump up the U.S. tax level by 10 percentage points of GDP to fund a welfare state, well, you couldn't just fill that all in by printing, probably. You would have to, suck some money out of the economy to offset inflation. And on the other hand, I would say well, this maybe gets into the distributional aspect of but busting up the national debt a lot, because the thing about the national debt is that, it's mainly held by rich people. And if you're issuing a ton of interest-bearing bonds, you're basically paying rich people to sort of sit on money, right? And that may be necessary in certain circumstances, but if you can get to a place where you don't need, you could orchestrate your economic institutions such that you don't have to do that, I feel like that would be maybe a more ideal situation. But, again, the more sophisticated MMT people, I think, they'll have, convincing responses to that. But I do often see from the sort of fellow travelers or whatever, the kind of MMT crowd on Twitter, that it's just contemptuous of the idea that you need taxes for anything, and you can just kind of do whatever you want. So, yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so I think Ryan's onto several things there that I agree with and that I think should be elaborated on, or that I would like to elaborate on. The first thing is there is definitely this phenomenon, and I think this happens everywhere with every particular political movement. But yeah, you have the core group of MMT people who have done a lot of thought on this and a lot of work. I mean, literally, they've been building this system of thought for the last 2 or 3 decades in a few little grottos in the academic world, and no one's been paying attention to them until now.
I think that's an important point, though, Jeff. You should mention how much research and work has been done by this group of economists that is new and that adds actual scholarship to economics.
Yeah, there's a huge amount, and I myself have not read nearly enough of it. But yeah, there's a shit ton of papers. They've issued plenty of books. They have textbooks that they've issued that I don't know how many economics courses use them, but they're available. And like, I do think there's in terms of like the political debate around MMT, this matters in the sense that like they've just as kind of like a human group social dynamic. They've been at this for a long time. Suddenly they're getting attention, and there's this kind of conflict of like, on the one hand, they want to get out there and get like everyone to know about what they're doing. On the other hand, there's like a kind of, they're very, there's a combativeness because like you've been like on the outs for so long, and suddenly like, you're like, well, why didn't everyone pay attention to me before, kind of thing. And then on the other hand, like, they have done so much work, and they have such a detailed system of thought set out that, like, in some ways overlaps closely with, like, progressive Keynesianism, and then in other ways, like, goes way out into new areas that are just, like, completely beyond what people are have been thinking of, that it can make the conversation difficult. So, like, there was this thing that two economists, J.W. Mason and another guy whose name I embarrassingly cannot pronounce. But they did a paper that essentially...
Arjun Jayadev.
That is his name, thank you. That essentially used an idea called functional finance as a kind of... I mean, and Mason himself said later, it's like, okay, look, functional finance is not the same thing as MMT, but we kind of used it as like a stand-in for MMT for these purposes. And functional finance is just the idea that, like, you use taxes and spending to balance the economy at full employment rather than using taxes and spending to, like, quote unquote, balance the budget. But this caused a bit of a hoo-ha because, on the one hand, it was the paper was very good. Like, it was a very well thought out, like, application of these ideas. On the other hand, the MMT people were like, this is not what we mean, right? And I think one reason that people reached for functional finance as like a stand-in for MMT was because it was like the closest step over from like the current macroeconomic setup. It's like functional finance was far enough over to be an interesting change, but still within the realm of what people could conceive of. So there's this kind of problem of like, now that the mainstream is paying attention to MMT, there's this huge amount of scholarship out there that it needs to like absorb to like have a detailed discussion about MMT. At the same time, people in the mainstream have lives and they can't read everything. And, so they make, assumptions, and they use kind of quick and easy heuristics, which is totally understandable. And then on the other side, the MMT people are like, this is not what we mean. This is a gross oversimplification. This is wrong, blah, 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 which is also totally understandable. And it kind of turns into like it can be a mess, and then it's just 1,000 times worse when you run it through Twitter, which is a terrible platform for anyone to have a discussion on. It should be burned to the ground, but that's a separate issue. Anyway, I think I went on a digression there about the human social dynamics of this debate. So let me refocus. What was the question?
I guess maybe to wrap up this, the MMT piece here, a lot of the MMT literature that I've read is, as I said, very focused on tracking the specific accounting mechanisms of how precisely the government funds itself, with the objective of sort of proving that taxation isn't really how the government is like funding its day-to-day operations. But I think one of the things I like about MMT is that it's sort of taking a step back into the broader macroeconomy when you're talking about fiscal policy to deal with, to say that like taxing and spending and borrowing, whatever, what really matters is the overall performance of the economy, whether you have full employment and inflation that's not too high. And I think that focus on the accounting stuff is somewhat misguided. To say that, like, well, taxation is not really funding the government. Like, what funds the government is the concert of all of the government institutions operating in concert, it seems to me. Maybe you can correct me on this. But, you have your taxes, you have your sovereign currency issuer, You have your debt that is denominated in your own currency. You have your infrastructure and so on. You have your broad political legitimacy throughout the whole country, and on and on and on. All of that works together to fund the government. And, whether like the particular order in which dollars are exchanged between like various government departments is kind of missing the point, I would say. And, well, I mean, we were talking about the UK. UK has a much more limited ability to fund itself compared to the United States by printing money because it doesn't have the world's reserve currency. And that's the thing that, the US does have. So, perhaps it seems to me as though like that particular focus of MMT, would you say, Jeff, is somewhat misguided in terms of its, particular focus?
I think it gets I think it gets talked about too heavily in terms of their general audience stuff, right? Like I think they've done a service in the sense that they've really tried to like go through the mechanical operations between the Treasury and the Fed and taxing and spending and try to lay it all out. I've gone through some of that stuff. It's fascinating. It's extremely educational. But yeah, I think it is there. Yeah, it could kind of, it's just like when we have these generalized political debates, like out, like, on like the major networks and all that kind of thing. There's a real question of like, well, when you say like pay for the government spending or fund the government spending, what is meant by that? Do you mean literally where do the dollars come from? Or do you mean something a bit more generalized in the sense of like, how do we manage the trade-offs inherent in government spending? Because the point is not that there are not trade-offs. There are definitely trade-offs. The point is simply that you don't have to worry about where the money comes from. So I think people can talk past each other in the sense that like the MMTers can be like, we don't have to worry about where the money comes from. And then the people who are saying, how do you pay for it? They're like, well, I didn't mean literally how do we get the money. I mean, how do we manage the trade-offs,
that's a great point, Jeff.
Right?
That's a great point. Because what you're saying is perhaps the talking past each other is specifically because just to back up a little, there is a great service to debunk as much as possible for the citizenry at large the kind of household budget model that we've just talked about being trash and totally right not applicable to the government. So there is a service in saying no, you don't need to fund things the same way that a household needs to fund things. But there is, as you say, a trade-off between, say, borrowing from the future. So there is a sense in which, you are doing something now possibly at the expense of the future, but that might be a trade-off worth doing, and that's the debate that should be had. But when people say, where's the money coming from, maybe what they mean is, why are you saying it's better to borrow against the future, or why aren't you explicitly talking about this trade-off?
Right. Now, the other thing I would say is that one help that I think does exist in going through the mechanics of that kind of thing is it can expand your idea of what the options are, right? So like we say, okay, we want to build a bridge. Like we want to build a bridge. The national government wants to build a bridge somewhere. And okay, if we're not at full employment, great. We deficit spend to fund this thing. But that raises the question, okay, we're issuing bonds. All right. Okay. So like normal operations, we deficit spend, the money goes out, we don't raise any taxes, but we do issue bonds. The national government issues bonds to cover this spending. Well, those bonds are going to pay interest. Who's going to have the bonds? Well, like Ryan said, it's mainly going to be rich people. They're going to get the interest payments. Inequality will go up. Do we want that? Is that good? Is there something we could do to mitigate that? And so then if you know the mechanical operations, you can start going through, well, could we issue bonds with a lower interest rate? Could we issue bonds with no interest rate? Now, the question becomes like, would the market still buy those bonds under those conditions? And the thing to note there is that ultimately the point of issuing bonds is not to get the money, quote unquote. You don't need to get the money from anywhere. The point of issuing bonds is that issuing bonds is one operational option among several for managing inflation if it shows up. So you can start and there's no perfect answer, but you can start working through the options. Like, should we start thinking of entirely new debt instruments that the federal government should issue? Should we go to a system where we just sometimes we don't issue bonds at all and we rely on taxes to absorb any inflation that might occur? And this gets into I'll just make one more final point, then you guys can jump back in. I think this also gets to one other thing where I think MMT is pretty different from the other schools of thought, in that it seems to me they have I mean, you can agree or disagree with their conclusions, but they have done an enormous amount of detailed thought in how inflation actually works. And what I mean by that is if you look at the mainstream accounts of inflation, it tends to be a very crude model of we have workers, unemployment falls too low, we run out of workers, wages get bid up, then inflation goes up. Now, we have not actually seen that kind of inflation, arguably since World War II. That was clearly an instance when we saw, we just overpressurized the economy because we had to fight a goddamn world war. And so we shoved way more spending through the economy and used up every single resource to build bombs and planes and everything else. And we got, I don't know, Ryan, you might know the numbers on this better than I, but I think generally speaking, we got up to 10% inflation during the war years, if not higher.
It was fairly limited, but that was largely due to just economy-wide price controls,
right,
and rationing.
Right.
It is a hugely invasive structure of, you can't get. It was so much gasoline, so much rubber, and so on, and a lot of steel drives and whatnot.
So this crude model of inflation is really what the Federal Reserve's monetary policy is based around, right? It's well, if we're getting too high to using up all the workers, we need to raise interest rates, and that will basically the point of raising interest rates is to raise unemployment a little bit more so that the economy cools off. And the point you see made by a lot of the MMT crowd is that, first off, if you go through the mechanics of how monetary policy actually works, their argument is that it's actually a very muddy, not super focused, rather contradictory way to stimulate or cool off the economy. It actually works in ways that are much more complex and much less reliable than the kind of crude generalizations from the mainstream about how monetary policy works actually are. So their point is, this system we have of raising and lowering interest rates through the Federal Reserve to control the macroeconomy is not a good system for controlling inflation. And what they propose is really, this is probably where MMT goes the furthest out. You talk to various people, and I'm thinking Scott Fulweiler, Rohan Gray, a few others, Kelton too, that kind of thing. But they really envision a vast array of institutional policy operations for managing inflation. And I'm talking price controls, what Ryan mentioned. They consider an enormous amount of different regulatory dials we could introduce into the banking system. And why regulating the banking system could be important for inflation is something we can get into. And they're basically, they wrote, some of them wrote an article in the Financial Times not too long ago that kind of got into this. But basically, they imagine a kind of coordinated effort. Antitrust is involved in this as well, but just a coordinated effort between a lot of regulatory agencies that would kind of go through the economy and surgically find places where inflation is happening and figure out what the fix needs to be, as opposed to this crude kind of broadsword that the Federal Reserve brings with interest rates, where it's just like, oh, we're worried inflation might be happening. Okay, we're just going to like hike interest rates a few basis points, and like, you know, that's going to throw some people out of work, and it's going to cause some businesses to collapse. And
so let me ask, Jeff.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. I'm excited now because I have a few questions about this. So, do you think the resistance to MMT is either the progressive Keynesians or whomever don't buy the more sophisticated ways that MMTers say they can actually control inflation, or is there more of an ideological, because you could also see this politically, hesitancy to let the government, because it suggests, I think, the government would get really involved in controlling the economy in a way that is definitely not laissez-faire, and especially when you talk about price controls and all that. Is there an antipathy or a resistance to the ways in which you'd be giving so much power of regulation? How much do you think the former and the latter play into the resistance to the MMT proposals? Because this is really interesting.
So I think there's definitely the first. I think a lot of people, even in the progressive Keynesian space, they imagine there are two tools for controlling inflation. There's interest rates and there's taxes. And we've settled on interest rates to do it. And that's probably better than taxes on the whole. It's a kind of prudential political judgment, I should say. And the idea of this kind of, like I said, like large array of regulatory agencies and other things like getting involved in controlling inflation is kind of so far beyond the models they have in their heads that it's just Jordan Weissman had this great line that he told me that it's like, and he meant it generously. He did not mean it to be like cynical or insulting, but like he described MMT as kind of like macroeconomic science fiction, because like it is like this extraordinarily like wide imaginative take on a completely different like institutional setup for managing inflation. Like it really is just completely different from anything we're thinking about right now. And like, you know, you can go through it and maybe you think it's something we could do, and maybe it's not. Like I don't know.
But aren't economists theorists though? That they you know, I had a professor once who said if assumptions were horses, economists would ride. And so I think economists are generally fine with relying on pure theory. So I find it hard to believe that they would, if they've read the MMT scholarship and they're just like, I don't know, I would have to have a lot of faith on something we haven't tried practically. Is that really the resistance, or do they have a problem with the scholarship?
I don't know. I mean, like, honestly, like that would take like a lot of deep conversations with these people that I haven't had. Like, I'm trying to like kind of go off what I've seen from like, you know, pieces written and a few conversations I've had and like Twitter wars and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think the other point you made though is good, is that a war, like the World War II political economy of like that very kind of detailed government managerialism to kind of keep the economy at full employment, but to keep inflation from rising too much in any particular way. That is, you know, I think a fair analogy of like the kind of end game that MMT imagines. And I think there's just a lot of instinctual. Even I think a lot of people on the progressive side and the Keynesian side have internalized a set of instincts around like the limits of what government bureaucracy can be expected to achieve, and the limits of what like government bureaucracy as like influenced by democratic politics can be expected to achieve in terms of precision, in terms of timing, in terms of weighing of outcomes and weighing of priorities. And I mean, like you look at the arguments for why the current setup is good, most of them are political, in the sense that like we think of taxes as picking and choosing winners and losers, but we don't think of interest rates as picking winners and losers, even though interest rates totally do pick winners and losers. We just don't think of them doing that politically. So using interest rates to manage the economy is less politically fraught. Or it's the idea that like, you know, oh, a democratic government could never respond in a timely fashion in the ways that are needed to manage the macroeconomy and keep it balanced. So, like, it's good that we have these technocrats who at the Federal Reserve who are handling things instead. Although, I mean, like, really, MMT's, ultimate vision for how this would be managed is almost just as technocratic. Like, they really, that's one of the reasons I think they got resistant to the use of analogizing MMT to functional finance, because functional finance really does rely on taxes and thus democratic decisions by government on a continual basis, by Congress on a continual basis. And that's actually not really what they're envisioning. So yeah, that's like, those are like I don't have a concrete definitive answer for you, but like, yeah, I think all those things are kind of
right,
like wishy-washy in there.
Well, Ryan, you tell me what you think as we transition to the next topic, because I think this might be a good place to do that. It seems to me that Keynes, literally not just Keynesians, but Keynes and FDR back in the day, in the New Deal and their response to the crises of the time, we're definitely taking chances and doing things and experimenting economically and politically in ways that maybe you can analogize to MMT. And when we're talking about the Green New Deal and we're talking about job guarantee, there's a lot of unknowns, but like the basic conservative or risk-taking binary seems like the MMTers are more on the side that Keynes and FDR were on, doesn't
it? Yeah. I mean, you look at the World War II economy, it was gigantic borrowing, which was backstopped by the Fed, and in a very coercive way, especially afterwards, they had Regulation Q, and they had, the Fed officials at some points they would like go around to banks and be like, we noticed you're not holding enough treasuries. We're going to remember this next time you need anything from us. And financial repression, basically just trying to pin down the financial sector and force them to fund this thing. And on the other hand, this like elaborate price control mechanism. I don't know that Keynes would have really disagreed with. I think he basically endorsed all of that stuff. He thought it was like a great way of doing things for the most part. Actually, in fact, thinking about it, I wrote a piece about John Kenneth Galbraith, who was the head of price controls during World War II for a while, and Keynes actually came to his department and said that this is no good because you need to be controlling taxes via inflation, you need to be controlling inflation via taxes. And they had found by experience that just wasn't enough, and that what you needed, in fact, was a regulatory apparatus to coordinate this stuff and to stop people from, raising prices beyond what was actually justified. So, yeah, I guess in that sense, I would say that it was a very illustrative experience in terms of, managing an advanced economy at its absolute maximum output. This is I would say the time in which the U.S. economy was pushed to its absolute limit, and in a way that worked quite well. It's like if you have sufficient determination, then you can really get a incredible performance. But it did take the context of wartime, which, is not really a total war mobilization, rather. And that really is not on the horizon, I suppose.
All right, that's the end of this part of the interview. Tune in for our next episode when we'll discuss the job guarantee with Jeff. And we'll see you next time.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.